Welcome once again to the CSEA Public Sector Local and Unit Election Committee Training Video Series. This presentation is the fourth and final in a series of videos created to assist you with preparing for and running the election of officers for your bargaining unit. Before listening to this presentation, you should have listened to the Election Committee Training introductory video, as well as the video about nominations and petitioning, and the presentation about ballot design. This is Leslie Perrin, Deputy Counsel in the CSEA Legal Department and a staff advisor to the statewide election committee. This final training session will cover what happens the day of your election, whether you're dealing with return of mail ballots or holding an on-site election using the ballot box or voting machine method. We will go over the count process in detail, then explain certification and reporting of election results, as well as how to deal with protests and what to do once the election is concluded. When we left off last time, we had discussed balloting. You should have drawn for position, drafted your ballots, and made or had printed the types of ballots and envelopes needed for the type of election you're holding by this point. We will move on from there. For a mail ballot election, before we get into the gritty details, the steps that you will be taking include picking up the ballots from the post office, processing the ballots in order to count them, counting, recounting or breaking ties if needed, announcing and certifying the results. Before the day of your count, you need to secure materials that will be needed for the count. You will have received your voter eligibility list, so you need that with you to verify returns. If you issued any replacement ballots, you'll need to have that list handy, which was your MB8. If any candidates have advised you of the intent to observe, you need your intent to observe forms or proxy forms, as well as a sign-in log, which is MB9. You will have prepared and copied, make lots of extras, your tally sheets at T1 and T2, and you need the election report form, mail ballot election form MB11. For the location of your count, you need tables and chairs for your teams of counters. Remember, you can have as many volunteers join you and your committee members as you think will make the count go quickly and smoothly. Volunteers cannot be candidates, relatives of candidates, or people who have campaigned for any candidate in the election. Volunteers need to be members in good standing themselves in order to protect the integrity of the election process. And there must be sufficient room in your location for your committee, any volunteers, and any candidate observers or proxy observers to function and be able to see the entire process. As you process the ballots, you are going to want highlighters, pencils, pens, post-it notes, paper clips, rubber bands, letter openers, staples, and Scotch tape. Trays or box tops are helpful to keep things from falling on the floor as you sort and separate the different types of envelopes and ballots. As you count, you'll need pencils and sharpeners, rubber bands, post-it notes, tally sheets, and calculators. In order to box things up after the count, you will need boxes, packing tape, and markers. Your schedule and voting instructions will have indicated the deadline for the receipt of ballots to the post office or mailbox where they were to be returned, and your members and candidates are aware of the date, time, and location where the ballots will be processed and counted. On the day of your count, you will travel to the post office to pick up the ballots. Remember that candidates are entitled to observe every stage of the process, so they should be aware of when you plan to do this, and they can follow you if they would like to. If for some reason you had to pick up ballots early or at intervals because the volume was too high for your post office to handle, or if you had them mailed someplace other than a post office, you will have collected and kept them in a secure, locked place until the day of your count. Again, when you go to retrieve them, candidates are entitled to observe as you retrieve them from where they've been kept secure and transport them to the location of your count. If possible, you want your post office to give you some sort of receipt or certification of the number of pieces of mail that were received. This will include ballots and any additional non-election related mail that somehow wound up returned to your P.O. box by the date and time of the deadline. The post office will likely also give you any undeliverable ballots from your mailing that have been returned, and you should keep the unddeliverables separate. Keep in mind that we usually recommend that whatever post office box you've rented, you continue to hold on to for at least a couple of weeks after the due date set for your ballots, because additional returns will come in and it's possible that people will mail protests by accident to that location. So it's best to be able to hold on to that for a little while longer and remember to go back and collect that and close out the box. When you arrive at your location for counting, the first thing you will do is sort the mail that was received. Undeliverable ballots go in one pile. That means the things that got returned to you. Non-election related mail goes in another, like if you've got something that obviously isn't in the right kind of envelope, or if you got third-class mail or postcards of some kind that just got slipped in there. Returned ballot envelopes go in another pile. Separating returned ballots that are marked as replacements into yet another separate pile. Then you'll begin to verify returned ballots. First, take the replacement returns and check them against your voter eligibility list and your replacement ballot log. If the replacement received matches a CSEI ID number that belongs to a member on your voter eligibility list to whom you sent a replacement ballot as noted on your replacement log, you're going to put the letter R next to the member's name on your voter eligibility list. This will avoid double voting if the person also returned their original non-replacement ballot. That happens sometimes where they call you and tell you they haven't received it, and then you send them a replacement and things sort of piggyback in the mail. They get the first one a day or two later, they drop it in the mail, and then they get the replacement from you. Sometimes they mail that back too. You're looking to try to weed those out and keep them separated so that each person only votes once. You'll also place a check mark next to their name on the replacement ballot log to indicate that you did receive a ballot back from them. You're going to set aside all verified, valid replacement ballots returned in one pile. Place any invalid or unverifiable replacement ballots in another. Those would be ballots where they haven't put sufficient information on the return outer envelope for you to determine whose ballot it is supposed to be and whether it is a legitimate ballot, both one that you mailed out to that member as a replacement and also was returned by a member who appears on your voter eligibility list. So an invalid means the CSEI ID number does not appear on your voter eligibility list or doesn't belong to someone on your replacement log, and an unverifiable ballot means there was insufficient information on the outer return envelope for you to make that determination. Those do not get counted. Next, you're going to move on to the rest of your regular returned ballots. You will want one person to use the voter eligibility list and another person to read the CSEA ID number off the outer envelope. The reader will read the ID number and name off the outer envelope. The verifier will check the voter eligibility list to confirm and mark the list either with a check or with highlighter to indicate that a ballot has been returned by that voter. Valid verified ballots should be added to the pile of your verified replacements. If you find invalid, unverifiable, or duplicate returns, you will separate those into groups to record on your report later. Those will also not be opened. You will count the various categories of ballots, still in their envelopes, in order to record on your report the total number of ballots mailed and received, the total invalid returns, and the total returns that were deemed ineligible because you could not verify them. Next, you will open the valid returns by hand or with a slicing machine. You can have multiple teams working on batches at the same time. You're going to separate the outer envelope from the inner secret ballot envelope. As you do this, set aside any empty outer envelopes as well as any ballots that are inside the outer envelope but are missing a secret ballot envelope. Remember that members are entitled to ballot secrecy, but they may waive it. And also, in larger locals and units, once separated, the committee and volunteers engaged in the count might have no idea who the individual members are, so the lack of a secret ballot envelope really may not matter. The committee will decide what to do with those ballots. In either case, once all outer envelopes are opened and the guts are sorted, you will count and record the irregular items, such as empty outer envelopes, ballots lacking secret ballot envelopes, and write those on your report. You may also receive some love notes, set those aside as well. Batch up the empty outer envelopes with rubber bands and box them. You're going to repeat this process of opening the secret ballot envelopes and pulling the ballots out. If you use a machine slicer, this is where your Scotch tape may come in handy. Sometimes a portion of the ballot is cut and needs to be reattached before the ballots can be batched for counting. Any miscellaneous material that is inside a secret ballot envelope should be set aside, and you will eventually record that later. Batch up the secret ballot envelopes with rubber bands and add them to your boxes of empty outer envelopes. Then you're going to unfold all of the ballots that were removed from the secret ballot envelopes, batch them into groups of 50. You can do fewer if that makes sense for the size of your local or unit, but 50 is what the statewide election committee generally does. and you're going to put rubber bands around those groups of 50. You are then going to take a count of the total number of ballots removed and record that in your report. So in other words, you're counting the physical paper ballots, you're not yet counting the votes cast on them. Any questionable ballots should be considered at this time and a determination made as to how to handle them. In other words, those ballots that were in an outer envelope but didn't have a secret ballot envelope, some things that you think may contain voter identifying marks that are torn, or anything else like that should be considered. Whatever the committee decides has to be consistent for all ballots of that type. Add any questionable ballots that you plan to count to your batches. Record any that have been invalidated and that you are not going to count on your report form, your MB11. Then again, you're going to be recording the total number of ballots that are being processed to the counting of votes. Now you're going to count the votes. You're going to give each batch of 50, or whatever number you chose, a tally sheet, and you're going to mark the batches by numbering the tally sheet and recording the numbers on your master tally sheet. As counters deal with batches, you will have one person read the ballot and one person mark the tally sheet. Ballots with erasures or crossouts may still be counted where voter intent is otherwise apparent. And if markings void the vote for one office and the other offices that can be counted should be. Certain things such as circling a candidate's name or making checks in the box with the candidate's name rather than in the box that's where you intended the check mark to go, or placing a check mark next to the names of candidates who are elected and opposed, as well as next to a candidate on the slate who has yet to be elected. The use of whiteout to change a vote or any other stray marks that don't impact voter intent should be ignored, and the ballot should be counted. Slate voting can certainly make things easy if everybody just checks a slate box, but it can also make things interesting and complicated. Voters are permitted to check the slate box only in order to cast a vote for each candidate on the slate, but voters are also permitted to select from candidates across the entire ballot, one person at a time, so long as they cast only one vote for each position, or the proper number of votes if they can select more than one, such as for delegates. So when your ballot contains slates, you will likely see quite a bit of what we call overvoting. For example, if a voter checks the slate box for one slate and then also checks the box next to a different candidate for president, not on the slate, the voter has cast 2 votes for president, and that is an overvote for that office. However, the rest of the ballot may still be counted. The entire ballot is not void for overvoting unless there is an overvote for every position. An undervote is when no candidate has been checkmarked for a position. Again, the rest of the ballot may still be counted, and the entire ballot is not void for undervoting unless there are no votes cast at all. Occasionally you'll get a ballot where someone writes something across the top like, I don't know any of these people, but they still put it in the secret ballot envelope and in the outer return and dropped it in the mail. So that, where they haven't cast any vote at all, is an undervote. The process of tallying onto the tally sheets involves making sticks and bundles and columns on the tally sheets across the columns, kind of like you learned in elementary school. The sample ballot tally sheets are based off a maximum of 50 votes per line, which matches the 50 ballots in a batch, with the idea that that's how you batch them. Obviously, if your committee did something different, you'll take that into account on your tally sheets. If you have a problem during counting of a particular batch, your pair of counter, reader, and recorder should switch roles and take a new tally sheet and try again. They should also recount the batch of ballots to make sure that they had the number that they thought they did. It wouldn't be uncommon to think you have a batch of 50 that's really only 49 or 51 ballots. Once all batches are counted, record the batch results in the columns on your master tally sheet. In large locals or units, you will have multiple master tally sheets, so you will then need to make a master tally sheet. The chairperson will check the tally sheets for accuracy and total the votes for each candidate on the master tally sheet or sheets. The chairperson must then record the results on the mail ballot election report, the MB11. Whether to recount is within the discretion of the election committee. It should be considered only when the results for a race are very close. A recount can be conducted for the entire election or for a single position. Another thing that may happen is a tie. If there is a tie, the first thing to do should be to recount and make sure there really is a tie before you move on to tiebreaker options. If there really is a tie after a recount, there are 2 methods for breaking it to determine a winner. The first is that you may conduct a runoff election. This means you repeat the mail ballot process, but only for the office in which there is a tie. The candidates appear in the same position on the ballot. The alternative would be to break the tie with a coin toss. For this, however, both candidates must agree to the coin toss and sign the tiebreaker consent form, which is MB10. That almost never happens. Once all the results have been determined and the committee has signed the report, you will announce the results to all of the people and observers present. You will then take custody of all of the election materials. The committee needs to hold on to everything until your results have been certified to CSEA headquarters on the Election Results 1 form, and until any protests are resolved. You will then certify and report the results, send letters to all candidates, and mail your results to and file your results with CSEA headquarters on the results form. On-site balloting, whether you're using a ballot box or a voting machine election, there are several things you'll need to do to prepare before the date of your election. Some things will need to be duplicated if you have more than one voting location. Before getting into the details, you'll be checking in voters and observers at your site, distributing and collecting ballots or conducting machine voting of some kind. You'll count the votes, recount and break ties if necessary, and announce and certify the results. Before your count, you will need to secure materials for voting and counting. For the ballot box, you will have obtained and prepared sealed boxes in which to collect the ballots. For the voting machine, you'll have arranged for the rental, transport, and reading of some kind of electronic voting machine. You have received your voter eligibility list, which you will use to check voters in, along with a voter registration log. See Forms Ballot Box BB10 and VM9. If you issued any absentee ballots, you need to have the list handy. That's your BB7 or VM6. And if any candidates have advised you of the intent to observe, you need your intent forms or proxy forms, as well as a sign-in log, BB11, VM10. You will need to have prepared a sufficient supply of ballots and envelopes for the official or sample and challenge ballots. You will have prepared and copied tally sheets, and you need your election report form, BB13 and VM12. For the location of your count the day of, you need tables and chairs for your teams of counters. Remember, again, you can have as many volunteers join you as you think will make things go smoothly. And there must be sufficient room at your counting location for your committee, volunteers, and candidate or proxy observers. Even for a voting machine election where someone else will read the results on a machine for you, you will still need to be prepared to deal with and manually count absentee and challenge ballots. And if your voting machine is the newer scanning type, you will need all the same supplies as for a ballot box election, because you'll need paper ballots, and you must be prepared to hand count all ballots if a recount is needed or if there is a tie, as well as be prepared to hand count absentee and challenge ballots. For on-site balloting, your schedule has indicated the times and locations of your voting and counting. On the day of your voting, you will have committee members or volunteers, along with supplies, at each voting location set up and ready to go. Candidates are entitled to observe every stage of the process. When you arrive at your count location, you are going to set up tables and chairs for voter identification and sign-in. You need to set up a location where voters can mark their ballots in private. There should be a designated area for observers so that they do not interfere with voters, but at the same time, candidates and observers are entitled to be able to reasonably see what is going on. Remember, no campaigning inside the voting locations is permitted. You should process your absentee ballots at the start of the day. Any absentee ballots returned by the deadline must be verified against your log of absentee ballots distributed and against your voter eligibility list. The letter A should be placed next to the member's name on your voter eligibility list as an indication that the member voted by absentee ballot. This prevents the person from showing up at a polling location and voting again. The number of absentee ballots received must be recorded on your report. During the course of voting during the day, or whatever your balloting times are, each voter must appear during polling times with appropriate identification before being allowed to vote. Identification may be a driver's license, a work ID, a pay stub, a CSEA membership card, or any other form of photo ID that the committee has decided to use and has notified the members will be acceptable. As people present themselves at the polling place, you must see whether they appear on your voter eligibility list, then check them off or highlight them as you hand them a ballot and allow them to vote. Keep in mind that with multiple polling sites, you'll need a copy of the list at each site, and you may need to contact the members of the committee at other sites to update your list of voters to prevent double voting. If someone shows up who states they should be entitled to vote, but they do not appear on your voter eligibility list, you may permit them to cast a challenge ballot. That ballot, in a secret ballot envelope, placed in an outer envelope marked as a challenge ballot with the person's name, address, and CSEA ID number on the outside, will be set aside until later. You should also have a log for those people to sign in. Once your polls have closed, if you are staying at the voting location for your count, just proceed. If you're transporting ballots, the committee must seal the ballot boxes or whatever you're transporting the ballots in, sign across the seals, and transport them to the count location, which will be set up as described earlier. Again, candidates can observe this process, which means technically they could follow you. The first ballots to be handled at the count location should be the absentee ballots. If they were returned as undeliverable, count and record these and set them aside. Invalid returns must also be recorded and set aside. Your verified absentee ballots will then be opened, separating the outer return envelope from the secret ballot envelope inside. If any secret ballot envelopes are empty, these must be counted and recorded. If any outer envelopes contain ballots without secret ballot envelopes, the committee must decide whether to count them. All validated ballots will be counted. For paper ballots, you will open the secret ballot envelopes by hand or slicing machine. You can have multiple teams work on batches at the same time. Separate the secret ballot envelope from the ballot. As you do this, set aside any empty envelopes as well as any ballots that are missing a secret ballot envelope. The committee will count and record these irregular items on the report form. Batch up the empty secret ballot envelopes with rubber bands and put them in a box. Now you're going to unfold all of the ballots that were removed, batch them into groups of 50 with rubber bands, and count the total number of ballots removed and record that on your report. Make a determination at this time about any questionable ballots and how the committee intends to handle them. Whatever the committee decides must be consistent for all ballots, and any questionable ballots you plan to use to count will be added to your batches. Again, record the total number of ballots being processed to counting. And now you're going to count the votes. You're going to give each batch a tally sheet, mark the batches by numbering the tally sheets and recording them on your master tally sheet. As counters deal with batches, you'll have one person read the ballot and one person mark the tally sheet. Again, as indicated before, ballots with erasures or crossouts may still be counted where voter intent is otherwise apparent. And if markings void the vote for one office, the other offices should still be counted. Slate voting, again, can provide complications where there is both a slate box and boxes for individual names. You will often see quite a bit of overvoting for at least one office in a slate ballot. However, again, you are going to count as many of the offices as have a proper single vote for office or position as you possibly can, rather than completely invalidating a ballot for overvoting or undervoting. Again, the process of tallying involves making sticks and bundles and columns on the tally sheet across the columns, and the samples in the book are based off a maximum of 50 votes per line, with the idea that you batched your ballots in groups of 50. The chairperson will check all of the tally sheets for accuracy and total the votes for each candidate on the master tally sheet or sheets. For a voting machine election where there are no physical ballots, you will have the machine results read and certified to the committee. Then, any absentee ballots you counted will be added to your results. The chairperson must then record the results on the election report. Keep in mind that challenge ballots are only opened and counted if they might be outcome determinative. This means if the number of challenge ballots that you have received on the day of your election might change the result between a successful candidate and an unsuccessful candidate. If every candidate won by at least 10 votes and you have only 5 challenge ballots, you do not need to count those because they will not change the result. If your election is so close that you must consider challenge ballots, voter eligibility has to be checked with CSEA Headquarters Membership Department based on the information provided on the outer envelope by the challenging voter. For any verified challenge ballots, record the number that have passed verification and then open and count them as above for absentee ballots and add them to your results and report. Similarly, you may need to conduct a recount, which would require a hand count of any paper ballots used in a scanner voting machine election. Whether to recount is within the discretion of the election committee and should be considered only when the results are very close. It can be conducted for the entire election or for a single position. If there is a tie, the first thing you would do would be to recount to make sure there really is a tie. Then again, if there is a tie, there are two methods for breaking it to determine a winner. You can have a runoff election where there's a repeat of the balloting process, but only for the office in which there is a tie, or you can conduct a coin toss if both candidates agree and sign the tiebreaker consent form. Once all of your results have been determined and the committee has signed the report, you will announce the results to the observers who are present. You will then take custody of all the election materials, which the committee needs to hold on to until your results have been certified to CSEA headquarters and until any protests are resolved. You will then certify your report and report your results, send letters to all candidates, and file your results with CSEA headquarters. Again, on the day of your election, you will announce results to the candidates and the membership using mail ballot form 12, ballot box form 14, or voting machine form 13, and you will report the results to headquarters on the election results ER1 form. Before you can box up and ship off your election materials to the region office, where they'll be stored for 1 year, you must deal with any protests that have been filed or that are postmarked within 10 days after the election results are posted to the membership. There's information regarding protests in your manual at pages 71 to 73, and the statewide election committee advisors at headquarters are always available by telephone to try to assist you. Common grounds for protest complaints include substantial election procedural violations, like, let's say, the failure to have balloting at sites that are easily accessible to various members, ballot problems, like people were confused or there was no slate box when there was a slate, candidate conduct during an election cycle, such as improper campaigning, the denial of members' rights, or errors with slate voting. A protest must be postmarked within 10 days of when the protester knew or should have known of the conduct being complained of. There must be sufficient contact information from the protester so that the committee can communicate with them about the protest and forward any responses for further input. The protest must also contain a clear statement of the alleged violation and offer information that is sufficient to meet the burden of proof that what they allege took place. It's quite common to receive protests that really contain complaints which are simply not election violations. Protests in local elections must go to the statewide election committee. Protests in unit elections should go to the local election committee, and the local election committee decision may then be appealed to the statewide election committee. However, in certain instances, the local election committee can pass a protest directly to the SEC for determination, and/or the statewide election committee may take jurisdiction over a particular issue, depending on how complicated it is and if the statewide election committee has already fielded a number of phone calls about it. The committee must send a copy of the protest out to anyone named in it as having engaged in improper conduct, giving an opportunity to respond. The committee may also request information or response from any person deemed relevant, such as a member of the unit election committee alleged to have had conversations with the protester. Once all responses have been received, the committee should try to reach a determination, which would include stating whether a violation has transpired, as well as any sort of remedy that is appropriate to cure the violation. Remember that the committee is supposed to try to ensure a neutral and fair election. Some small bumps in the road do not necessarily mean that your election needs to start over. You get to the point where you can wrap up. Once your protest period has ended and you've handled or passed along any protests you've received, you can wrap up your election process. Reports should have been made and submitted to headquarters on the ER1, signed by the chair or vice chair. All election materials may be boxed and given to the respective region office for storage. And we thank you for your hard work during this election cycle. The democratic process is one of the most important aspects of being a CSEA member, and CSEA prides itself on making every effort to be inclusive and fair to all members in the election of officers. Your assistance is critical to that process. Thank you, and congratulations.